All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I'm afraid the rain might have scared off a few, but as someone in the audience just told me, if you're really interested in this area, you would have been here despite the rain. So I applaud that a lot. But yeah, we're going to talk about geopolitics in outer space today. My name is Trine Pejstrup, and I'm a research assistant here at DIIS. The program today is going to be just a quick welcome from my good colleague Ian Klinke, an associate professor at Oxford University. After this, we have Almudena Ortega, who'll give a presentation on space security multilateralism in the second space age. She is here as a researcher from the UN Disarmament Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, in Geneva. So thank you for being here today. She has published widely on space security and is very important for UNIDIR's work on space security and multilateralism. And after that, we have a virtual presentation from Mary Jane Rubenstein, who is here already, omnipresent with us. She is a professor at at the Wesleyan University and holds a PhD from Columbia University. So she'll be talking about the role of religion in the corporate space race, drawing specifically on her book Astrotopia. So we have these two presentations, and we'll have a few minutes after each presentation for Q&A. If you have a few questions, we'll take those after that. Then we'll have a short break for coffee and croissants, and then we'll set up for a panel discussion where there'll be a further discussion and also opportunities to pose a few questions. But first, I'll hand over the floor to Ian, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Trine, and good afternoon. So my name is Ian Klinke. I am at Oxford, but I was in 2023, 2024, Trine's office comrade here at DIIS, which is where our conversations began, which are now kind of leading to this event. My research interests are in the history of geopolitics, the far right, and nuclear weapons. But like many of you, and I assume that this is the reason why you're here, I have been drawn to the events surrounding the so-called second space age. Reusable rockets, mysterious anti-satellite weapons, the creation and perhaps even removal of debris in space. And in this brave new world, American space companies can offer an invaded state's internet coverage and then threaten to take it all back shortly after. So like you, I've tried to make sense of what I hear, what I read, what I see. So I think what Trine and I really wanted to understand was what characterizes this era in which things have become awfully congested, controversial, and contested in outer space, after decades really in which not so much happened. And of course, the question of armed conflict and war is absolutely central to this. Now, this is not the first time that war came to space. The first human-made object in space was not Sputnik. It was a German projectile fired at Paris in 1918 by the so-called Paris gun, and which reached stratospheric heights of around 40 kilometers on its way into the French capital. But it was, of course, Wernher von Braun's Vergeltungswaffe 2, which was both the prototype of the intercontinental ballistic missile and the moon rocket, which kick-started the first space age, defined by the use of liquid-propelled rocketry, by a small number of state actors pursuing military aims in space. I think we can argue about this, but not very long. and who brought with them a certain geopolitical imagination. They projected the geography and politics of the Cold War into outer space. So it's a very statist imaginary of that, of those early decades. Now, the second space age, we can argue on when exactly it began, but the 2010s are often seen as a starting point. But there's also the around 1990. But it has entailed not just the spread of new technologies, but also the vital improvement of older ones. There's a commercialization of activity and a diversification of actors. Now, these new corporate entities in particular also have geopolitical visions. And MJ is going to talk about her book Astrotopia in just a second and unpack some of these. But many of these imaginaries have anti-status conceptions. They operate, they see sovereignty as something that constrains them, and they try to kind of react to that. So I think that's they question the state's grip over sovereignty, and I think that's a crucial transformation. But whereas the spotlight has often been on a handful of American companies and their visions, the geopolitical visions of more traditional state actors in space, and that includes many actors these days, have sometimes been overlooked. And I think we just need to remind ourselves that for China and Russia, for instance, the idea that the US commercial space sector operates independently from the state is something that they don't necessarily buy into. And we can argue that there are some reasons why they might be right. But before I open up the set of questions for this afternoon, which our very distinguished set of speakers will address, I want to briefly catapult you back to the year 1897 and a bearded Russian math teacher who barely left his little village of Kaluga outside of Moscow. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky devised a highly esoteric philosophy known today in many circles as cosmism at this time. He believed that death was an illusion and that atoms and spirits were immortal. He also wanted to find new space for humans to colonize in other solar systems, and even for resurrected humans. He thought we were on the verge of being able to technologically resurrect the dead. And he was very much working in a Malthusian paradigm of dealing with overpopulation and projecting this question of earthly constraints into the cosmos. But he wasn't just a wacko. In 1897, he came up with his famous rocket equation, which correctly predicted the amount of energy needed for a multi-stage rocket to leave and to orbit Earth. He subsequently became known as the grandfather of the Soviet rocket program, and he met Stalin and so on. And his most famous quote, perhaps, about Earth as humanity's cradle, you can't stay in the cradle forever, you have to leave, hangs over space travel as a fantasy, over science fiction ever since. It's spoken, for instance, in a version by Michael Caine in the Hollywood blockbuster Interstellar, which I'm sure many of you have seen. Which is, by the way, a film which is, of course, filled with planetary escapist tropes and settler colonial imagery, which MJ will unpack. The example of Tsiolkovsky, but then also highlights a number of things which I'm hoping can help us to make sense a little bit about the second space age. The first is that when we're dealing with the important work of periodization, when does one era start and another end, we have to remember that in many ways we are still in a universe which was set up more than 100 years ago. Visions of cosmic transformation, geoengineering, and population transfer, but also a certain type of rocketry, which is the vehicle that gets us there. That, I feel, to a large degree, remains intact. But then the second thing that I think the example of Tsiolkovsky highlights is that there's this jarring tension between, on the one hand, the kind of visions or fantasies of what might soon be possible in outer space, and then sort of reality of what actually goes on the ground. And I think we have some speakers who are able to help us deal with the reality of what is currently out there, both in terms of legal framework, but also in terms of policy and technology. But I think, as Vibeke Chorova argues in a recent DIIS report, which is also linked on the event website, we have to take both the vision and the technological change seriously and understand its interplay. Now, we can only guess what Tsiolkovsky would have made of all of this. 1897 was incidentally also the year, so the year of his rocket equation, was also the year in which Friedrich Ratzel published Politische Geographie, which was the foundational work of geopolitics, and which spawned the modern geopolitical tradition. And in it he argued that states had to be understood metaphorically like organisms that were struggling for space, an idea which had a huge impact on the formation of National Socialism in the 1920s. Ratzel was interested in astrobiology too, like his mentor Ernst Haeckel. And he was interested in outer space, but somehow he did not foresee that empires would soon navigate the skies much like Great Britain and the East India Company navigated the seas. Many of his contemporaries already did foresee this, of course, not just in science fiction, but also non-fiction writers. Curiously, however, it was not until the 1980s that serious attempts were made to project geopolitics. And as to understand geopolitics as a sort of military form of knowledge by states, for states, a way of trying to understand how environment and geomorphology, the makeup of the planet, shapes history subtly over time, right? How this form of knowledge was then extrapolated and projected into space. It's only really in the 1980s that this is done systematically. And it's people like Colin S. Gray, the nuclear strategist, who's one of the first. And then it's Everett Dolman's Astropolitics, which you can find out there if you want to have a look, which is a sort of manual for understanding how the 19th century imperial struggle is just continued in outer space today. Very controversial book, of course. And if you want a more popular version of that, you only need to walk into your local bookshop and pick up Tim Marshall's latest The Future of Geography, which sort of rehashes those arguments in a not very imaginative way, where the outer space becomes this kind of place of zones of influence, of zones of strategic interest. There's certain places that are beneficial for states to control certain resources and so on. But now it is less about geomorphology or climate, because viewed from outer space, the Earth is as smooth as a billiard ball. It is more about orbital mechanics and ballistics and so on. But in the vision of these astropoliticians, there's an inevitability that what will be pursued in space will be conflictual. And I think, and I'm coming to the end here, there are more interesting ways of thinking about outer space than doing it through the lens of classical military geopolitics. And I think this event is an opportunity for us all to find out about some of these other ways. And it's very much with that in mind that we assembled our lineup. In essence, we want to find out how technology is changing, what can be done, what can't be done in outer space, how states, different types of states, have responded to the corporate challenge, and what the limits of doing geopolitics in outer space might be. At the end of it, Trine and I will write a policy brief for DIIS, and there was also going to be the recording online if you want to refer back to it. But for now, I will stop here and hope you enjoy the ride.
Is this working? Yes, it is. Hello, everybody. My name is Almudena Azcárate Ortega, or Almu for short. I am the lead researcher on space security issues at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you, DIIS and Trine and Ian, obviously, for the invitation. It's really great to be able to talk about one of my favorite topics ever, space. I know I only have 20 minutes. So Trine, please do let me know if I'm rambling on. But I will touch on some of the issues that Ian already introduced and it's going to be a bit of a mix of topics. So I would like you all to keep 3 items that I want to bring up in mind. I'm going to talk about what are the debates or what are the initiatives that are going on in the multilateral context, particularly at the UN. That's one. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about what are the laws, the key laws or legal frameworks that apply to space, not necessarily directly related to what actually states are talking about, but actually what is applicable. And so it's either what states are talking about or should be, but they are not talking about. And then in third place, who are the players? Who are the key states or the stakeholders that are involved in these discussions, and what are their roles and contributions? So to start with, as Ian already indicated, we've been talking about space security for a long time. And even though we have, this is a topic of discussion that we've been dealing with for a long time, at the UN, we don't really have that much to show for it if you think about laws in the more classical sense as hard law. So we don't really have a space security treaty, for example. But that doesn't mean that these discussions have not been happening for a very long time. The very start of discussions surrounding space were actually very much security-oriented. States very early on realized the importance that outer space had for their military pursuits, especially intelligence gathering. So it was definitely a military domain, and it continues to be a military domain to this day. And it's important to distinguish this from space being a weaponized domain. This is what states and other stakeholders, but particularly states, don't want to go towards. And back at the very, the very first forays of humankind into outer space, this is something that really concerned the big players then, which were mainly just 2 states, the US and the USSR. But the rest of the international community was concerned as well that the conflicts or the issues that had emerged during the Cold War, those tensions of the Cold War, would also extend to outer space and eventually even make the Cold War an actual hot war. So that's how the Outer Space Treaty negotiations started. It was due to these space security concerns. But we actually can see that the Outer Space Treaty doesn't really have much security-related language, nor do all of the other treaties that we currently have, which is all of these treaties. So if there was any doubt, if you take anything from this talk, is that even though space might be a void, space law very much is not. We very much have a concrete legal framework when it comes to space, and we do have a concrete legal framework when it comes to space security. Even though space security is not very explicit in any of these treaties, it is definitely there. We also have non-legally binding initiatives that have been successful over the years. As you will have noted, the last treaty that we have is from 1984. And if you were to look at the number of states that signed and ratified these treaties, it definitely goes on a decline. Like, you will see a declining number. The Outer Space Treaty is the one with the most ratifying states, and the Moon Agreement, the one with the least. I think it currently has 18 signatories and 18 ratifying states and 11 additional signatories. So that's not really a lot, and some states have called it a failed treaty. But then non-legally binding initiatives became more fashionable, so to say, because they were perceived as easier to agree. So here we have 3 examples, the 3 most significant examples in the space security field, although there are other examples in the peaceful uses of outer space field. And I'll be happy to talk about them a little bit later. As I was saying, the language of the Outer Space Treaty is not very security focused. We see a lot of mentions to peaceful purposes. We see that as well in Article 1. But that is not to say that security isn't there. The reason why I'm making this distinction is because at the UN, we do very much like to have a neat little boxes where we separate discussions. So space security, which is the focus of my work and the focus of the work that states do in Geneva and also at First Committee, is very much focused on intentional actions. So, for example, shooting a missile to destroy a satellite. That is an intentional action to harm something in space. And then space safety, or the peaceful uses of outer space, which is handled by the Committee on the Peaceful Uses in Vienna. It focuses on non-intentional hazards and risks to space, like, for example, a derelict satellite having a little piece break away from it, or things like that. So it's important to keep that distinction in mind. But let's go back to the language of the treaties. Even though, as I was saying, they are not very security focused, security is very much there. And these are the two most important articles in terms of space security. You might have seen a lot of references to specifically Article 4 this year in the news when there was this rumor that a country was developing nuclear weapons to be used in space. So there's been a lot of discussion at the Security Council regarding this article this year. So Article 4 prohibits the placement, the installation, or the stationing of nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in space, as well as the testing or use of any type of weapons, also conventional weapons, on celestial bodies. You will see that it doesn't really say anything about conventional weapons in the void of space in operational orbit, and that's an issue that has led to many space security discussions and many states wanting to have a treaty that specifically focuses on that. And then Article 3 is also important for security purposes because it states that international law, and specifically the UN Charter, applies to outer space. So this is important because it means that a bunch of areas of law and a bunch of treaties apply to outer space where relevant. So obviously we do have the UN Charter, and specifically the reasons why the drafters of the UN Charter wanted this mentioned explicitly was because of Article 2.4, which of course prohibits the use of force or the threat of the use of force in space. But we also have many other areas of international law, like a lot of arms control treaties mention space explicitly. But there are others who maybe don't mention space, but are nevertheless relevant for space. We have air law and law of the sea, which are often two areas of the law that are compared to outer space, and they can help inspire a lot of the principles that exist in the Outer Space Treaty, like, for example, the principle of due regard in Article 9, which is not defined in the Outer Space Treaty, but is actually defined by these two areas of the law, particularly law of the sea. And then we have international humanitarian law, which has been very present in the news and in diplomatic discussions with regards to outer space. International humanitarian law, of course, is the legal framework that applies in the context of an armed conflict. And in this day and age, modern conflicts, especially conflicts between states, will very much always involve space technology. So if we have a conflict on Earth that involves space technology, IHL applies. And if we were to have an armed conflict in space, which hasn't happened yet, and let's pray that it doesn't, then IHL would be relevant as well. But let's move on to the players and the discussions. The reason why we don't actually have a treaty or something more specific on space security is because states haven't really been able to agree on these two issues. They haven't been able to agree on what to ban and how to ban it. So traditional arms control mechanisms really focus on capabilities. They ban nuclear weapons, they ban specific types of weapons or specific characteristics of items. But that doesn't always work in space because a lot of technologies in space are dual-natured. And so that means that you have to look at behaviors or actions. How do states or other stakeholders use their space technologies? And is that something that can be regulated? And then the how to ban, there have been states that have traditionally supported the establishment of a legally binding agreement, and others who have seen that maybe it's harder to come to an agreement when it comes to something legally binding, and it would be easier to agree on something non-legally binding. This also has to do a lot with the legal cultures of the states that support these measures. So, for example, civil law tradition states tend to support legally binding agreements, whereas common law tradition states tend to be more open to non-legally binding. But with the passage of time, and specifically in recent years, and this has been influenced by the participation of the commercial industry and other stakeholders in these space security discussions, we've been seeing that these two incompatibilities, which were seen as mutually exclusive, are actually not mutually exclusive. Capabilities and behaviors can be regulated at the same time, and we can have negotiations for something legally binding as well as something non-legally binding, because these two types of instruments really complement each other. In fact, the Outer Space Treaty was, before it became a treaty, it was actually two UNGA resolutions, two United Nations General Assembly resolutions. And then we have instances where, from a treaty like the Outer Space Treaty, we've seen the development of non-legally binding instruments. Specifically in COPIOs, we have the debris mitigation guidelines or the long-term sustainability guidelines, which help clarify some of the principles that we find in the Outer Space Treaty. So, keeping that in mind, keeping all of these different ways of creating mechanisms to address space security in mind, we've seen a lot of different mechanisms over the years. But we have seen limited success. Well, not all of these efforts have been successful. There are some that have been successful, though. Don't want to, be fatalistic about the situation in space security. What this highlights, what the willingness of the international community to continue to negotiate and talk about these issues highlights, is that these are important and that space security is something that concerns everybody. This is actually one of the questions that I get the most in the context of my job, especially from smaller states or middle powers. Like, why should we care about space security? Especially if we're not spacefaring ourselves, why should we care? And the reason why everybody should care about space security is because even if a state might not be spacefaring, everybody is a stakeholder in space. And that doesn't mean just states, but it also means commercial companies. It also means individuals. For example, I use Google Maps to get here today, and I have that technology thanks to outer space. So, everybody uses space technology in one way or another every day. So everybody should care that these assets are kept secure to ensure that those services can be used on Earth. Also, these efforts help identify gaps in countries' understandings. There are countries that are, have been doing space for a very long time, like the US, Russia, China. They very much know what's going on, but there are other countries that don't really know how orbital mechanics work. But they nevertheless want to have a seat at the table, and rightfully so, because, as I was saying, they are stakeholders. So it's important to ensure that we know these gaps so that institutions like UNIDE and civil society can also play a huge role into bridging those inequalities in knowledge. And then also, more and more countries are becoming involved. A few years ago, it was pretty much the big powers that cared about space security. And now everybody is looking to be involved in space security. And in fact, we've transitioned from GDEs there at the top to OEWGs. GDE stands for Groups of Governmental Experts. These are closed groups. And now we have OEWGs, which are open to not just all states, but also every single stakeholder. I have a few examples of what these OEWGs and these GGs have looked like and what they have sought to achieve. So this OEWG happened in 2023, and it introduced something new. It introduced the initiative to look at behaviors, as I was saying before. We had looked at capabilities before, but this was a bottoms-up approach that encouraged states to also consider states and other stakeholders to consider what they believed were threats to space systems and how these could be mitigated, what were responsible and irresponsible behaviors in outer space. By the way, this group, even though the discussion was advanced, it didn't reach a consensus report, unfortunately. We've just concluded a GDE on further practical measures for Paris. So this was an effort to issue recommendations for a potential legally binding agreement. It just concluded in August, and we reached well, no, I say we because I was in the room, but I was not a state representative. So it's a royal we, but it's the states, the experts chosen by states reached a consensus report, and it marks the very first consensus instrument on Paris. So when I was saying let's not be fatalistic, this is a huge success that we've seen this year, and I know that we'll talk a little bit more in the Q&A about this. These discussions have also fostered the desire to continue to build upon what has been said. And so last year, states proposed 2 resolutions to have 2 new OEWGs. One on space threats, so that the behaviors approach that I was speaking at the beginning. And this seeks to build on the discussions that were had in that 2023 OEWG. Even though it was not successful, as I said, it really advanced discussions, and it really encouraged states to continue to talk about the issues that were found the most concerning. Like, for example, intentional damage to space systems, harmful interference, rendezvous and proximity operations. And then they had another proposal to create another OEWG on further practical measures. So the GD that just ended, to build on that GD that just ended. But these 2 OEWGs would be happening at the same time, and a lot of states have actually asked if they can be merged. So it's very easy for big delegations like Russia or like the United States to go to everything. They have the budget and they have the personnel, they have the expertise. But for smaller delegations, it's a lot harder. And in order for them to be part of these discussions, they are looking into merging these 2. We don't know what's going to happen, but hopefully we will see a merging. And it's important that we try to be inclusive of what every delegation can assume, because again, we want to have as many voices in the room as possible. It's harder to reach consensus when you have a lot of more different perspectives, but the consensus that you reach is a lot more long lasting if you manage it. To conclude, I will say that every year we have resolutions at the General Assembly on space security, so this is definitely a topic that continues on. But yeah, these are the ones from last year. The first committee is in session right now, so we will see new resolutions this year. Some of them with pretty much the same names to continue the work, essentially. But to conclude, I would like to say that we have a lot of initiatives, so it's very evident that there is no one-size-fits-all for space security. We will continue to have different space security issues that will emerge over time, and we have to be ready to tackle them. Then the second thing that I want to conclude with is that space security is an issue that concerns everybody. So that means that everybody has to be involved. And middle powers have a lot to say, and they actually have the power to move the discussion from one way to another, to act as a nexus between the usual adversaries. And that's actually what we saw in the recently concluded GD. That's one of the main reasons why we reached consensus. And the last thing that I want to point to is that there is no need to reinvent the wheel. At the UN, we have this issue that every time states want to propose something new, something innovative, they want to be able to say, oh, I was the one who came up with this idea. And that is great, but we already have a strong, robust legal framework that I was talking about at the beginning. So we should refer more to it. We should try to rely more on it, because if we have common understanding on the issues that we already have, the treaties that have already entered into force, it will be easier to come up with new solutions. So, having said that, I think I've gone a little bit over time, but I hope it was interesting. I definitely have a lot more to say about all of these topics, so I hope that you have questions, and if not, I hope that we can move on to a very interesting debate during the round table that we will have later. But I don't know if
we'll do a short Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah, but thank you so much. Yeah, Malcolm. Thank you so much, Almu. Such an interesting perspective. And you've been working with space security for a very long time.
So, in space security, I think maybe around 6 years or so,
Yeah.
but with Uniter I've been there for like 3.5 years or something. Yeah.
It's a growing field. All right. If anyone has any short questions for Almudena right now, we can take a few. Anybody? Rory? Yeah? We'll just have the mic on because Mary Jane is with us online, so she can follow.
Thank you so much. And it's good to start with a bit of optimism and a bit of confidence in the rules-based order, so-called, existing. So I kind of wanted to ask on that about the relationship between this kind of robust framework that you've laid out and pointed to, and the question of enforcement. And it seems to me that there's a massive gap there. It's not just a question of reinventing the wheel in terms of making new laws. It's about enforcing the existing framework and the problems around that. So, yeah, it's a very open question, but what you would say about that?
I don't know if we want to take an additional question. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. No, I have a very similar question to Rory, which is really about how you know when a particular legal framework has been successful in shaping behavior and norms. Is the fact that Russia didn't strike Western assets in outer space since February 2022 due to the fact that there are these legal frameworks? Is it due to the fact that it was unclear whether this would be maybe even a NATO Article 5 kind of case, which I think nowadays it would be, and or is this perhaps because there's technologically not much of a rationale for Russia to do this? How would you know?
Okay, so to make sure that I have it, the first question was about enforcement, and the second was sort of similar about success of a. I think you meant it kind of broadly, but were you referring to like success of like the creation of a new norm, or was it like success of an existing agreement, or
Any of these agreements.
Okay. So enforcement. So I am an international lawyer, and I feel like this is the bane of the existence of every single international lawyer. Like, international law is not real because it cannot be enforced, blah blah blah. And I get it. I feel this is the question I get the most when I when I go to conferences and present at events like this. The space treaties actually do have a mechanism for enforcement. Specifically, the Liability Convention has a specific procedure to ensure that if there is an issue, it can be raised and a commission can be created to address the damage and the person responsible, the state responsible, and make sure that damages are paid, are compensated. But actually, it's almost been activated 2 times, and in both of those occasions, it's been resolved through diplomatic means. And that's pretty much what tends to happen when it comes to space law. And I would say many times other fields of international law as well, that the diplomatic component has a lot of weight. And, sometimes it because obviously you cannot put a state in prison like you would with criminal law, for example, which feels a lot more satisfying, like, oh, you have wronged somebody else, so you have to be held responsible for it. And of course, with states, that's really difficult. First of all, it comes to an issue of geopolitics, of allies and adversaries. So if a state A feels that state B has wronged them, then it's also how the rest of the international community reacts that it's going to influence whether that state is sort of condemned or not. Also, there is a second issue to consider, is that states sometimes are very reluctant to say that international law has been breached. So we have a very good example with kinetic ASAT testing. And we've had several instances of this. 4 countries have actually tested direct descent kinetic missiles against their own satellites. And the international community has reacted badly in all of those 4 instances. But they've they've mentioned words like this is irresponsible, this is reckless, this is bad for space sustainability, but they've never actually said this is illegal, this is a breach of the Outer Space Treaty. The state that came the closest to saying that was Japan, I think, after the 2007 tests by China. And it only said this could perhaps constitute a breach, like events like these could perhaps constitute a breach of the Outer Space Treaty, referring specifically to Article 9, the due regard principle. So the reason why they don't condemn it more strongly is because states want to leave doors open for themselves. They want to know that if their national security demands it in the future, they will have access to these technologies themselves. And if they condemn them as illegal, they cannot really do that. Of course, you can carry out enforcement measures through, again, diplomatic means. So issues like retortions or countermeasures don't seem as exciting as putting someone in prison, for example, or as visibly effective, but they actually have very real consequences. Nobody wants to be the pariah in the international community, and this can have direct consequences for citizens. If you have commerce sanctions, then maybe your citizens are not getting food in their supermarkets. So consequences for breaching international law, having those diplomatic fallouts, they can be felt in a very real way by citizens. And I think we're seeing this, for example, in the context of the war in Ukraine. So even though it's less flashy, so to say, enforcement mechanisms are being used. And in terms of success, I will say that to assess the success of any measure, whether it's legally binding or non-legally binding, you would want to look at three components. Compliance, so legally binding agreements are more likely to be complied with, so that's also what makes them a little bit harder to negotiate, because states only commit to them if they are really sure. Then there is the issue of participation. The more widespread that a measure is, the more successful it is. So for example, talking about space debris again and ASAT testing, we're seeing it with the US initiative. They came up a couple of years ago of the committing not to carry out direct descent ASAT tests. And so far, I think 37 countries have issued their own unilateral commitments. It became a UN resolution that had 155 votes in favor. So, the mindset has sort of shifted. If you had done this in 2008, nobody would have signed on to this. But this shows that there's been a shift in the mindset of the international community that debris is bad. It's bad for sustainability in space, and it's also bad for sustainability on Earth, which is what a lot of the global South specifically care about. They don't think of space security as counter-space weapons, but they think of it as these are services that I need for my sustainability here on Earth, and I have to ensure that I can continue to receive them. And then the third item that you would look at is the specificity of the measure. So a measure that is more specific might require more know-how. A measure that's more general, like for example, the Outer Space Treaty might be easier to agree on because it's a treaty of principles, and because principles leave a lot of room for interpretation, then states might be more keen to agree on those. So you would look at those components to assess whether a measure is being successful or not. And also, laws are hard law is perhaps more firm in time. It's harder for it to die, but non-legally binding measures can wither and die pretty easily if you don't have that widespread participation. And even hard law as well, So it's hard to say, but it's on the states that perceive the breach to call out the state that they perceived as the one who has breached that precept. And oftentimes they don't do it because they want to persevere alliances and their own status in the international community. So that's where the middle powers and the emerging spacefaring actors have a lot of power, because they care a lot more about substance when it comes to space security than they do about politics oftentimes. So they can do a lot of influencing in that way.
Perfect.
Yeah. super long answer.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. Let's give Almu another round of applause. And then we'll get Mary Jane online on the screen. Perfect.
Am I online? Am I on the screen?
You are.
Delightful. Hi, everybody.
Thank you so much for joining.
So happy to be here. Let's do this. Let's see. Wait, hold on. Let me share my screen first. Apologies for the delay. There we go. And then, how is that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Is that visible?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, hi everybody. This is Connecticut. Welcome, Connecticut on the eastern seaboard of the US. Thanks so much to Ian and to Trine for the honor of this invitation. I'm so sorry not to be there with you, but I'm very grateful that you've allowed me to join you virtually. So thank you so much. Okay, here we go. In October of 2020, a team of justice-minded astronomers and astrobiologists published a white paper for NASA. It's a long and dense report, but the upshot is that NASA's current approach to outer space amounts to colonialism, and that NASA ought to work toward a more ethical exploration of outer space through, as you can see here on the slide, tighter planetary protection protocols, enforceable international policies, and we're hearkening back to our previous speaker, community input and consensus, environmental stewardship, the moral consideration of microbial life, and the regulation of extractive capitalism. During the 4 years since this paper emerged, a surprising and increasing number of journal articles, magazine pieces, podcasts, and a few books, my own included, have joined these voices in identifying the US-led public-private approach to outer space as in some way colonial. What I'd like to ask today is what that means and why anybody should care about it. After all, isn't outer space just empty space? Who cares if anybody colonizes it? A few weeks after this anti-colonial white paper was published, the Mars Society's CEO and president, Bob Zubrin, wrote a screed against it entitled "Wokeists Assault Space Exploration." From Zubrin's perspective, any effort to slow down progress in outer space through regulation, environmental oversight, or planetary protection amounts to an effort to shut down the space program entirely. For Zubrin, it's either full speed ahead with unregulated launches, space mining, and terraforming, or we're doomed to extinction on this increasing wasteland of an Earth. For what it's worth, I actually often avoid calling the space industry colonial, first because it makes me sound like an annoying American academic and it alienates people. And second, because I'm trying to refuse that logic that says we either have to conquer and plunder outer space or our entire species will die out. From my perspective, our current ecological crisis has been brought about by escalating practices of conquest and plunder over the last 5 centuries. So it makes very little sense to me to try to escape this existential crisis by extending it into the cosmos. To my mind, the alternative is not conquer and plunder or die, but rather conquer and plunder and die, because ransacking the universe is bad for everybody, or find a healthier way to relate to the universe that we're part of. Okay, part one. There are two parts. On October 23rd, 2020, during that same month that the anti-colonial white paper dropped, the US was nearing the end of its presidential election season, with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris challenging then President and Vice President Trump and Pence. We, like you, were also 7 months into the epidemiological nightmare we now just call COVID. And in the middle of it all, the Republican Party tweeted a final distillation of its campaign platform. Here it is. "Pres Trump is fighting for you," it exclaimed. Here are some of his priorities for a second term. Again, this is 4 years ago. First, establish permanent manned presence on the moon. This is first priority. Second, send the first manned mission to Mars. Remember, this was a time when most of us hadn't left our houses for half a year, and these were the priorities. After the moon and Mars came infrastructure and Wi-Fi, and then in a follow-up tweet, the campaign promised a COVID vaccine, medical supplies, and pharmaceuticals, but they clearly wanted that extraterrestrial stuff out front. Rockets are sexier than respirators. During his first 100 days in office, President Biden signed 60 executive orders, almost half of which were direct reversals of Trump-era policies. The Biden administration disagrees with the Trump administration on almost everything except outer space. In fact, the only major Trump-era objectives that Biden and Harris have retained are first, the creation of a space force to wage orbital warfare, and second, the plan to settle the moon and Mars through the mission they've named Artemis, after the Greek goddess of the moon, the twin sister of Apollo. Why do we need to settle the moon and Mars? In Biden's perplexing words, because America can do big things. We can see possibilities no one has seen before, go places no one has gone before. I honestly don't know what this means. The message was frankly clearer in the Trump administration, which insisted it is America's duty to spread its influence throughout the universe. As Trump declared in his last State of the Union address, in reaffirming our heritage as a free nation, we must remember that America has always been a frontier nation. Now we must embrace the next frontier, America's manifest destiny in the stars. Manifest destiny, a 19th century coinage, was the idea that God was calling European-descended Americans to expand across the whole North American continent. So when Trump reminds the U.S. spacebound U.S. that it is a frontier nation, he's extending this notion of manifest destiny cosmically. The God who called 19th century America to conquer the last frontier of California is now calling 21st century America to conquer this infinite frontier of outer space. Now, as we all know, Donald Trump did not invent the idea of space as the final frontier. Rather, the metaphor originates with former Nazi rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, whom Dr. Klinke has already summoned into the room. The year is 1952, which is to say 7 years after the end of World War II. Most of Germany's leading physicists have been granted amnesty through the CIA's then secret Operation Paperclip. And in March, Collier's magazine publishes a special issue called Man Will Conquer Space Soon. The lead article, written by the man who designed the V-2 rockets that incinerated London and Antwerp, was called Crossing the Last Frontier. So here's where that connection between outer space, the frontier, and manifest destiny takes root. And then it flowers and blooms, if I can extend the metaphor, during the last decade as the role of private industry in space has expanded significantly. By the time the Trump administration revealed its plans for NASA's next big directive, Elon Musk's SpaceX was already ferrying people and materials to the International Space Station. Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin was battling SpaceX for government contracts on a lunar lander. And Musk was preparing his burgeoning fan base to leave this doomed planet and colonize Mars. Meanwhile, space mining firms said they were preparing to start extracting and selling water, ore, and precious metals from asteroids and the moon. And space tourism companies were promising orbital joyrides and overnight stays in a hypothetical space hotel named after, guess who, Wernher von Braun. How did we get here? In the spring of 2019, Vice President Mike Pence surprised the industry and elected officials alike by declaring the administration's intention within the next 5 years to return the U.S. to the moon. So he said NASA's rockets were going to have to be updated and fast. Operating under an unexplained intense urgency, Pence spends a good deal of this speech threatening NASA. Step up, he orders. And if you don't, we will find someone else who will, like Musk or Bezos or Branson, because regardless of the means, says Pence, we are going to the moon. Again. As he reaches his conclusion, Pence shifts from commander to preacher. Let us go with confidence, Pence says, nodding his head. And let's go with faith. Faith in America, faith in our astronaut pioneers, etc. And lastly, says Pence, let's have that other kind of faith as well. Faith that these astronaut pioneers will not go alone. And here's where we get a historical roundup of the United States fusion of conquest and Christianity, right here. For as millions of Americans have cherished throughout the long and storied history of exploration by this nation, let's believe, as the old book says, that there's nowhere we can go from his spirit. If we rise on the wings of the dawn, if we settle on the far side of the sea, even if we go up to the heavens, there his hand will guide us, and his right hand will hold us fast. Pence's lofty language here is an adaptation of the Hebrew Bible, whose Psalm 139 asks, "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there shall your hand lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast." Again, biblical justifications for American pioneerism are nothing new. The 19th century gave us manifest destiny, but manifest destiny was drawing on a theme that stretches back to the 16th century, when the first English settlers thought of themselves as God's new Israel. Just like Abraham, Moses, and Joshua, the pilgrims believed they were called to settle a new promised land, a new Canaan across the seas. And there's a town called New Canaan, just about an hour south of me. In fact, there are 20 in the US. There are 20 New Canaans in the US. What's ingenious about Pence's invocation of Psalm 139 is that it extends God's land donation not just from Israel to New England, not just to Florida and California, but all the way to infinity. Even if we go up to the heavens, Pence reminds us, God goes with us. So wherever we go in the universe, that's the promised land. In outer space, America has found an infinite Canaan. Now, if you're looking for a quick way to understand this connection between the European religious conquest of the Americas and the American religious conquest of space, you might think back to the 1960s and remember that as they saw the lunar sunrise, the Apollo 8 mission took turns reading the first chapter of Genesis. Just a few years later, Apollo 11 performed the ritual gesture of installing an American flag on the moon, just as the conquistadors had installed flags and crosses in the New World. Myth and ritual, this has always been the way people of Christian heritage have conquered new land. So when I do give in to abstractions and call the US space program colonial, I'm calling the industry's current public-private partnership an extension of the white European seizure of the Americas, the white American seizure of the continent, and the capitalist seizure of the globe. And interestingly enough, no one really disagrees on this matter. Even Musk and Zubrin will agree that the conquest of outer space is the next chapter in the long story of European conquest. Here's the title slide from Zubrin's recent talk. You'll see the happy endorsement of the term colonizing, the comparison of outer space to the so-called New World, and the proclamation of space as the final frontier. So at this point in the argument, there's no debate. We all agree we are on the same colonial course that conquered Earth. The question is whether or not that's okay. And here's part two. You'll see that I like simple questions. Is it okay? For the anti-colonial astronomers, of course, it's not okay. Exporting the genocidal, ecocidal system of capitalist accumulation to space will, for them, exacerbate inequalities on Earth, create inequalities off-world, and intensify the ecosystemic imbalance of our planet, its orbits, the moon, and the solar system. For the pro-colonial folks, here's a photo of Bob Zubrin with his protege Elon Musk. The anti-colonial folks are just wedded to being miserable. Sure, earthly colonialism has had some unsavory consequences. Even the most gung-ho of extraterrestrial frontiersmen will concede that the earthly frontier did in fact destroy and displace indigenous communities. They may also concede that it exploited Black, immigrant, and indigenous labor. Some of them will even admit that capitalist expansion, which Jeff Bezos calls using too much energy, has thrown the earthly ecosystem way out of balance. That said, what was a good idea with bad consequences on Earth is to these astro conquistadors a great idea in space. After all, there's genuinely nothing there this time. No people to displace, no bison to push to extinction, no forests to clear cut, or rivers to pollute. Nothing there. But one of the things I try to point out in the face of such claims is that not everyone agrees that outer space is empty, uninhabited, or even outer. The Bawaka country of northern Australia tell us that their ancestors live in the wider galaxy, where they continue to guide human life on Earth. For this reason, Bawaka country is increasingly distraught at the wreck that SpaceX satellites are making of low Earth orbit. In a co-authored academic paper, the community pleads with the larger space agencies to regulate launches and clean up the mess the industry has made of their ancestral lands, both on Earth and beyond it. Similarly, Inuit elders tell us their ancestors live on the moon. When a white anthropologist living with an Inuit community asked them in the early 70s if they'd heard about Apollo's lunar landing, Armstrong, Aldrin, the footprints, the flag, they apparently burst out laughing. When the anthropologist asked what was so funny, they reportedly said, "We didn't know this was the first time you white people had been to the moon. Our shamans have been going there for years. They go all the time." The issue is not whether we go to visit our relatives, but how we treat them and their homeland when we go. Maybe the best known story of the idea that space is not just empty territory comes from the late 1960s, when NASA leased a large tract of Navajo land to test the module that would deliver Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the lunar surface. As the project drew to a close, the Navajo singer asked a NASA official to deliver a recorded message to the people of the moon. The NASA official turned to the chief to ask him to translate the singer's message, at which point the chief stalled a little bit before saying, he's telling the moon people to watch you guys carefully because you might screw things up on the moon the way you have on Earth. So what is a secular space enthusiast supposed to do in relation to these indigenous stories about relatives in outer space? What I've found is that even those spacenicks with growing ethical concerns about Musk, Bezos, Branson, the effective altruists, will nod politely when they learn of the Bawaka or Inuit or Navajo relatives among the stars, but they won't really take them seriously. Everyone knows there aren't really people out there, right? Everyone knows mountains aren't really ancestors, rocks can't really be alive, and the moon and Mars don't have people in them, right? And if rocks are just rocks, then what does it matter what we do to them in space? In response, I tend to say it doesn't actually matter what you believe. It matters how you behave. I don't have to believe that my friend's dead parents are actually watching to behave respectfully at their gravesite. You don't have to believe a cathedral is actually a sacred space to refrain from carving your name into the altar with a penknife. All anyone has to believe is that social relationships are important enough that we should treat things other people value with respect. So in the hopes of finding agreement not on beliefs, but on behaviors, I tend to offer a jovial, stacked set of reasons to refrain from ransacking the universe. The first reason, and the hardest for some non-Indigenous folks to accept, would be that for many human beings of the Earth, there are people out in space, and their homelands should be treated respectfully, the same way you would maybe take off your shoes in someone else's home, even if you leave them on inside your own. If the space industry finds itself able to respect the truth of ancestral homes in the cosmos, then that should be sufficient reason to explore the cosmos without ransacking it. But if they can't go that far, then maybe they can acknowledge that outer space has its own ecology, with fragile planetary atmospheres that ought not to be thrown out of balance. As the jointly authored Declaration of the Rights of the Moon insists, the moon maintains its own environment and landscapes, contains a history we're just beginning to understand, holds deep cultural and spiritual meaning for human beings, and is critically important to the healthy functioning of Earth. Think tidal regulation, planetary spinning on its axis, etc. As such, the moon ought to be treated, they say, with the respect and care one would bring to a national park or wonder of the world. Again, if we can all get on board here with the protection of the moon's integrity for its own sake, then we don't have to keep going. But of course, many of us, including the Planetary Protection Agency at NASA, do not in fact think the moon deserves to be preserved as it is. So if lunar rights seem like too much of a stretch, maybe we can all agree that the moon, Mars, and even asteroids are archaeologically and geologically significant to improving our understanding of the universe. If we blast, mine, and following Elon Musk's suggestion, nuke planetary bodies with impunity, we will have lost scientific access to the history of our solar system. Shouldn't we at the very least treat other planets as precious archaeological sites? But if the reader can't get that excited about extraterrestrial geology, one might point out that capitalist land grabs have tended to create appalling working conditions. What happens when anti-union billionaires bring workers with no independent access to food, water, a way home, or air to staff their hotels, build bunkers on Mars, service their restaurants, pilot day trip rockets, and facilitate asteroid mining? And if the reader isn't concerned about space laborers, what about the capitalists themselves? As the two world wars of the 20th century demonstrated, capitalist land grabs are bad even for the grabbers. Along my reading, although I will absolutely defer to Almu on this, this is what the 1967 Outer Space Treaty was trying to say. You know, the like spirit of the law, not the letter of the law, when it declared that planetary bodies were not subject to national appropriation. Still reeling from Europe's near total implosion at the dawn of the century, the 1960s UN didn't care about the right of rocks, or I think really even about labor conditions or the dispossessed of the earth. They cared about the possessors of the earth, who'd torn themselves apart in the frenetic wake of decolonization. What they were saying in the Outer Space Treaty was effectively, let's not do all that again. Let's do things differently when we go out there. And finally, even if the listener really couldn't care less about what happens in outer space, about how we treat planets and asteroids, their environments, or their physical and metaphysical inhabitants, I'd like to remind all of us that our current approach to outer space is doing extraordinary damage to the Earth itself. Even if Elon Musk never makes it to Mars, SpaceX has made a disaster area of low Earth orbit. Of course, that's not just SpaceX, but he sends up 60 satellites every 2 weeks, right? And has decimated the wetlands of Boca Chica, Texas. The Starship that exploded 18 months ago has done untold damage to land, waterways, turtles, and birds, not to mention cars and human lungs and houses. And the industry's rocketing number of launches are depositing kerosene, carbon, and sulfur into the upper atmosphere, where these substances will remain far longer than they do in the stratosphere, escalating climate change beyond anything our models have accounted for. So even if you don't care at all about space, I'm suggesting you might care about what space, at least as we're currently pursuing it, is doing to Earth. And at this point, I would hope that nearly all of us can agree we can do space better. Okay, I'll stop there so we can talk more informally. Thank you so much for listening. Looking forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Mary Jane. Do you have a couple minutes just for a single question or two?
I do. I'm here, yes.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Does anyone have a quick question for Mary Jane? I know Ian has, but I want to give other people a try. Ian, do you have anything?
Thank you. No, it's a really, really fantastic book. One thing that I wondered about is, and I think you very convincingly show the Christian iconography, tradition, mythology that is at play here, and you do that in a lot of detail, obviously, in the book that you didn't have time to do here, and it's hugely convincing. But I was wondering what role Darwinism plays in this, and the book's relatively light on that. And what the reason was for that. I mean, someone like Zubrin, astrobiology and so on, these kind of imaginaries are, I think, different, and they end up sort of potentially arguing the same thing, but they're coming from such different perspectives. I just wanted to have your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much, Ian. I really appreciate it. And again, thank you so much again for the invitation. So first of all, I'm a person who does sort of intellectual history of Europe, and I am not as convinced as others are that Darwinism is as much of an antithesis of Christian thought as other folks seem to be. It's an outcropping. It's perhaps maybe technically an antithesis, right? The kind that kind of stems from a Christian ontology in order to try to oppose it, and then we move on to something else. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different physics and metaphysics at play here. And yes, the Christian iconography, the Christian ritualism, etc., is there. There's also the kind of new American charismatic kind of new agey movement that inspires some of these very charismatic billionaire CEOs. That's a different style of religion. That's not, I wouldn't assemble that under the category of sort of traditional Christian imperial, again, in your words, iconography. That's a different kind of strand. And then, yes, another strand would be the Darwinist and even social Darwinist idea that we need to, that the human species is evolving to such an extent that it, has outgrown its cradle planet and needs to seed itself and others elsewhere. But part of the reason that I think that this has such traction in this particular context is that it is getting, its way has been paved by Christian teleology. Its way has been paved by this idea that there's a promised land out there waiting for you, that history is progressing farther and farther towards some kind of realized kingdom of God. This is not, strictly speaking, this is not like medieval Christian eschatology. This is American Christian eschatology that often looks very kind of indistinguishable from Darwinism and even a kind of social Darwinism. The only difference really is whether or not you stick God back at the beginning of the processes. But thank you for that question.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I'd love to hear myself, Mary Jane, if you see space security or at least outer space endeavors as present in the upcoming elections and the campaigns for that.
This is just the thing. I don't see a major difference in policy and space policy between a possible Harris administration and a Trump administration. When Biden was just elected, he had just taken the oath of office. Everybody was kind of rocked from the January 6th attempted takeover of major buildings in Washington. So everybody was kind of reeling and people weren't quite sure how to do press conferences. But in the middle of all this, toward the end of January, somebody asked a Biden spokesperson, like a press secretary, what he thought of the Space Force, what Biden thought of the Space Force. And this guy laughed. He laughed as though to say, there's no way we're hanging on to the Space Force. And the outcry against this reaction was so extreme that Biden had to come out with a statement a day or two later saying, of course, we love the Space Force. We love our guardians. We love our very brave men and women in uniform. And we are going to throw all of our energy behind the Space Force. There's really been, to my mind, very not much of a difference in space security policy. There might be some kind of my sense is that the biggest impediment to progress in the field of international security and international agreement and collaboration is this standoff that the U.S. is in with China, which is written into law in the Wolf Amendment that prevents NASA from cooperating at all in any way with anybody at the China National Space Administration. I've got a colleague at NASA who says he can't even buy a cup of coffee for a Chinese official from the space agency. That's a major problem, and I do think that one party's extreme anti-Chinese rhetoric is more dramatic than the other, but both of them kind of stoke these fears of particularly Chinese dominance on the moon that I think will end up endorsing whatever it is the U.S. military thinks it needs to do to keep itself safe. If I were in charge, I would go after the Wolf Amendment, but nobody has asked me to work on repealing the Wolf Amendment.
More to come on that. Maybe they're listening in. But thank you so much, Mary Jane, for joining us today. We hope to speak to you soon again. For everyone else, we'll have a short 5-minute break and set up for the panel discussion. So please grab some coffee and croissants, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. Thank you.
No, yeah? Okay. Welcome back. for round 2. The speakers have already been engaging in some discussion over the last 5 minutes, so I was eager to get everyone back in the room so we don't miss any of this. Welcome to What is New About the New Space Age. We will begin. I have asked the 3 panelists to tell us what their pivotal event of the last 12 months was in outer space and how it highlights particular important trends. And so we're going to have a round in a second, and we're then going to have a broader discussion about technology, about the corporate challenge, about the most important recent transformations in the legal realm, about destructive and positive trends. But we keep, I hope, circling back to this question of the geopolitical and of the colonial, which we've already addressed in earlier sessions today. So on that note, I will hand over, and I think we should probably just do it if you start, Almu. And then we've got Johan Eriksson, who I need to introduce, of course, who's a professor at Södertörn University in political science and an expert on outer space politics. And we've got Rory Rowan, who's an assistant professor at Trinity College Dublin in geography, and he's the author of On Schmidt and Space, although this is social political space rather than outer space. But it was Rory who first got me into the topic, so he's rightly here. Anyway, without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Almo, to tell us what your event of the last 12 months was.
Sure, thank you very much, Ian. I kind of spoiled it a little bit during my presentation, but I intentionally didn't talk too much about it because I knew this was coming. But I would say the kind of like space event, even though it's not an event that happened in space, but space-relevant event, was the recently concluded group of governmental experts on further practical measures for the prevention of an arms race in outer space. As you see at the UN, we do like very long names for things, which reached its consensus reports in August, and it was the first time ever that we've had a consensus document on space security, on the prevention of an arms race in outer space, or PAROS, as we call it, in the UN space security world. And it's true that this consensus report was not super novel, or it didn't make everybody happy. In fact, it is pretty much the reality of diplomacy that you reach, like you're doing diplomacy right when not one side is completely happy with the outcome. So it recapped a lot of what had been said in previous, not as successful initiatives, like it reaffirmed the Outer Space Treaty, the UN Charter, but it also looked at things like the right to develop and access outer space and space technology by all countries without discrimination. This touches on what was presented by Mary Jane just now. It set out a series of recommendations on elements and obligations like threats and use of force. What does this mean? This should be clarified and this should be prohibited. By the way, commercial break here. UNITY just published a report on the use of force in space, so would highly recommend that you go and read that. The prohibition of intentional damage or harmful interference to space systems, the importance of transparency and confidence building measures, of sharing space policies and doctrines, exchange of information, also another commercial break. UNITY has a space security portal where we encourage states to submit their space policies so that it can act as a transparency and confidence building measure for the international community. So, well, it was not a groundbreaking document. It is. It very much highlights that the international community is very much vested when it comes to the success of achieving space security and peace in outer space. So that is my event.
Thank you. Johan, do you want to go next?
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Ian, and thanks for inviting me here. and listening to these very interesting presentations. So the event for this year, 2024, I have to be very subjective and very local, and it's about the Swedish defense and space security strategy, the first ever, that was just released a few days ago, and we've never had one. And for a long time, space was not an issue really in the Swedish military. They started to say we need that. Other powers have it, so we have a Swedish space strategy, general one, some 10 years ago, and now this September we have a military space strategy, and it's very similar to the NATO space security strategy, and it refers to that one. And one of the unique things in this is that now it's clearly stated that Sweden needs independent launch capacity. And we have a space infrastructure in Kiruna in northernmost Sweden, and they wanted to expand that and make it possible to launch military satellites for communications and intelligence and control. So that is, and be part of the NATO framework as well. So that is very new to me and to Sweden. But from a more geopolitical point of view, I think what is more important is not what happened this year, but what happened last year. About a year ago in August 2023, I know we talked a bit about the moon, all of these moon missions, unmanned so far, how Russia tried. It was a long time since they tried, and they sent their Luna 25 probe, and it crashed on the surface of the moon. And just 4 days later, India, for the first time ever, managed to successfully land an unmanned probe on the surface of the moon. So to me, from a geopolitical standpoint, this symbolizes the shift in global power, how Russia is on decline. They inherited the Soviet space program. They haven't been very successful, a lot of mismanagement in that. They've tried to develop new projects, but this is just a symbol of decline with Russia as a great power. And India may be growing in power, and obviously China taking the lead here in relation to the United States, which is still the strongest space power on Earth. And there are others as well, Japan, for example. So those are the events.
Good. So just want to do the usual. Thanks to Trine and Ian for inviting me here. First time in Copenhagen, so it's great to be here. So I actually had forgotten that Ian had asked us to do this until last night. We were returning from the restaurant. So I scribbled notes, so I'll be a bit less fluid perhaps than our other two speakers as I consult them. So this event kind of was in my mind already, and I was thinking, how do I kind of extrapolate on this? So on October 31st, 2023, last year, the Houthi forces in Yemen launched an attack on Israel across the Red Sea, 2 cruise missiles and 1 ballistic missile. And this was, of course, in solidarity with the people of Gaza, then under bombardment by Israel after the October 7th attacks of that year. And interestingly enough, those 2 cruise missiles were shot out of the sky by F-35. Is that what they're called? Not interesting enough on its own, but the ballistic missile was the more interesting one here. It travelled around 1,000 miles, one of the longest range ballistic missile attacks that were made ever, not as a test, but as an attack. But that's not the significance here. It was that Israel intercepted the Houthi missile 100 miles above Earth as it made its descent. And this was widely reported in various branches of the media, particularly kind of engineering and space media, as the kind of, and military, kind of popular military, as the first kind of element of space where we've now entered the age of kind of weaponization of space. And so, as Almo rightly talked earlier about the difference between the militarization of space and then the weaponization of space. And there's kind of debate then about people saying, well, this actually in fact wasn't really a weaponization of space of this different kind. Where does space begin? We have this idea of the Kármán line, which is generally taken to be 100 kilometers or 62 miles above the mean sea level of the Earth. And of course, the Earth is not a perfect globe, so that shifts where it is. But it was seen to take part in the lower reaches of low Earth orbit. And again, low Earth orbit is something both within the scientific community, but also more broadly within commercial and state actors. There's different ways of measuring where low Earth orbit is. So there's some kind of skepticism that this in fact wasn't actually in space. Was it or was it not? And in some sense, I think that's an important question, but rather it's more about the way that this is reported, that kind of in itself is an event. And the fantastic publication Popular Mechanics, in its November 17th issue, it talked about this, and it said, and I quote, "The first battle in space wasn't the space war you'd expect. It was a battle of missiles between a rebel army and Israel. A psychological barrier, the idea that space is a domain unspoiled by mankind's vicious infighting, has been breached, and there is no going back." So this was kind of typical of some kind of popular, often quite tabloidy, that kind of space engineering, kind of quite macho kind of publications, where something had been breached. We're in a new age of space war, and we're now into this weaponized phase. And the mainstream press picked this up as well. The British tabloid The Sun, not a publication I'm often consulting, wrote in December 6, and it did take a while for this news to filter through. It says, "Israel wins world's first space battle as Arrow 3 shoots down rocket." Interestingly, space was capitalized there. I don't know why. The Times, the London Times, slightly more respectable newspaper, slightly more reputable, December the 5th, "How Israel's Arrow 3 intercepted a missile in space battle." And what's interesting here in some sense is that this is part of a broader kind of tendency we've seen in kind of Western, particularly British media, talking about Israel and trying to restore the invincibility of Israel after October 7th of last year. And we saw this again with the recent Hezbollah attacks on the pagers. Amazing, dazzling, incredible, emphasis on the technological prowess and ingenuity of Israel. And interestingly, the Arrow 3 was mentioned twice. I mean, we don't expect the average reader of The Sun to be thinking about what is Arrow 3, but they're drawn in, it's mentioned in the titles. And of course, where the rocket that was intercepted is from is not mentioned. We don't want to have the Houthis or rebel armies having capabilities to send rockets into space that can be targeted at civilians or military installations. So the Arrow program, it's now in its third iteration. The fourth is being developed, started in the year 2000, and so it predates the Iron Dome in Israel, and was developed alongside the US Defense Forces, and it was used for the first time in 2023 against these Houthi attacks. And I think this indicates something about the nature of the role of space within the kind of broader geopolitical arena. Of course, we've a lot of revision over the last week, looking back at a year of this genocide, let's say, rather than conflict. 17.9 billion of military aid has been sent from the US to Israel in this period, and indeed 4.86 billion has been spent by the US on its beefing up its own presence in the region. And of course, this is not really aid or assistance, it's a partnership. It's a kind of set of military, industrial and geopolitical relations that are shared there. And interestingly, and this is kind of brings us back to kind of Europe, on September 28th, so another event cascading out of this, in 2023, Germany and Israel announced plans that Germany would spend upwards of $4 billion on Arrow 3, and that was to start being delivered in late 2025. The sale, of course, had to be approved by Washington, but it was part of NATO's broader space strategy, this European Sky Shield, and this was part of a package of work there called the European Acquisition Focus to protect against Russian attacks from air, from long-range missiles. And again, we can situate this in Germany's Zeitenwende, the post-Ukraine invasion, and that kind of turned to kind of increased military spending and so on. And I would argue, as I have elsewhere, that it's best to understand Germany's change in its kind of new military footing, not with regard to Ukraine, but with regard to its relationship to Israel. And this is, from Israel's perspective, the biggest ever arms deal that Israel has done. And indeed, Israel's aerospace industries, who make the develop state-owned company, the Arrow program, have increased the shifts, and they've hired many more workers at a time when the Israeli economy is tanking under pressure to meet the 2025 target. So what do we learn, or what's significant about this, apart from the obvious in terms of what we want to talk about today? So in one sense, as I say, okay, there's a debate around whether this is in fact a breach into the first space war, the weaponization of low Earth orbit. In some sense, of course, there's concerns about this that we've heard already about risks and the Kessler syndrome of orbital waste and so on. In some sense, that's not what's most interesting to me, although it is obviously significant. And I think to me it points to these two broader tendencies. One is the commercialization of outer space and the militarization of outer space. And these are often, to my mind, in the literature, kind of opposed to each other. We have the space economy and we have the space state or space geopolitics. And I would argue that we must kind of see them together and not take an approach which is kind of state versus corporations or state versus capital, but rather understanding state and capital or state and business together. And that's the way through which we'll have a better understanding of the nature of how the relationship between commercialization and militarization are working together. And this brings me, and we can talk more about this in the questions, that we need to not only have an understanding of space geopolitics that looks at international law, but also kind of beyond the limits of international law into the kind of geopolitical domain, which is a domain of kind of power relationships, but it's also institutionally a domain of imperial powers, notably the United States, but also Russia and China, who are working through a set of military-industrial alliances and military-industrial competition, and that involves these kind of the private sector providing military weapons and dual-use technologies. So this kind of representation of this Israel knocking out this Houthi missile and the way it sits within the US-Israel alliance and the way this sits within the German-Israel alliance and the German-NATO alliance gives us this kind of networked set of relationships between commerce and geopolitics beyond international law, which I think is what we should be talking about. So it went on a bit long, sorry about that. Too many notes.
Thank you, Rory, and thank you everyone for starting us off. I now have a set of specific questions for each of you, but at this stage, I want to begin to loosen things up a little bit. So if others want to add to this or intervene in some way, that's now allowed. And then as a next step, I will involve the audience in this too. I'm going the other way around. So even though you've had rather a lot of speaking time just now, you're getting even more, Rory.
Your mates.
But what I want you to do, you've obviously taken us to one of the key geopolitical conflicts of this time, of our time. But I note that you use the term geopolitics relatively casually in the way that we all do in the geopolitical arena and so on, the geopolitics of outer space. But there is this very specific classical, power-based, geographical way of looking at outer space. And I just wanted perhaps for you to reflect a little bit on why you probably wouldn't operate from that framework, that theoretical framework. So to take a step back, to just give your reasoning and how we can, I suppose, analytically do geopolitics without falling into the trap of an imperially kind of defined geopolitics.
So thanks for the question. That's a hard question, one I hadn't thought about preparing, but I come from the tradition of what we call in geography critical geopolitics, which I'm sure some of you or all of you are well versed in. But that's a kind of school of thought, or it's broadened out into a number of schools of thought at this point, but that kind of try to situate the actions of states and also the kind of modes of thinking that we associate with the kind of traditional geopolitical thinking and geostrategic thinking within a broader set of social, cultural, economic relations, right? And so here we think trying to think about the interplay between shifting ideas, representations, so the kind of cultural domain and how it relates to the political sphere. I also kind of come from or have a foot in that sphere and a foot in kind of Marxist approaches to political economy and how we understand the shifting history of capitalism and how that relates to state formations, imperial formation, changes to global relations. And from this perspective, we don't just have the ideas and the culture affecting the relationships between states or the nature of the state, but also the way that situates within these kind of shifting political economic patterns. And I think both of those are important to kind of spread our view beyond this kind of very state-centered and simplistic account of, actors. There's certain sets of actors, they are power, there's big ones, there's small ones, and there's medium ones, and they have different amounts of capabilities, and they behave in certain ways, and we can understand those behaviors either through kind of rational actor paradigms or realistic paradigms. These are useful, and I think we shouldn't throw them totally out, but there's a reduction to a very simplistic understanding of what the state is, how it relates to other states and what its motives and reasonings and way of operating are. So I think we need to spread out how we situate geopolitical relations in a much broader field of socio-cultural economic relations.
You've given us sort of a theoretical, very, very, very robust theoretical reasoning. Are you able to kind of use an example where you sort of see how a classical perspective and a critical might fundamentally differ?
Mm. I mean, in one sense, at a very basic level, the point I ended on there in the initial comments, and that's a bit of a bugbear of mine at the minute, and I think this has been exacerbated by both the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a frustration I have been exacerbated in debate, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine and now with what's happening in Gaza and Lebanon, in this region, that we have a discussion about a kind of rules-based order and then states that don't follow that rules-based order. And it's kind of like, this is a bad actor state, Russia, China, less so in Western debate about the US. There's a queasiness about talking about this, but increasingly coming to the fore, and perhaps Israel. And I'm talking about state actors rather than non-state actors here. And I think part of the limitations of this model is that it obscures what I would see as to be a fundamental unit of political organization, which is the category of empire. To my mind, the United States operates in the broader West as an empire, and that is uncomfortable for many of us in Europe because we're integrated to some extent within this through all sorts of infrastructures and alliances. And if we understand the United States simply as a state, like other states, except just bigger and more powerful, we miss the kind of qualitative nature of how an empire works. And it works not only as we might think of classical European empires, of taking territory and so on. And there was a resurgence of the use of the term empire being used in Western political debate and media, referring to Russia as an empire in Ukraine and colonization processes. Let's say Western imperialism or US-led imperialism works through a whole set of other means and tactics. Some of those are political economic, many of them are political economic. Some are about the kind of cultural formations we see around kind of imperial structures that the critical approaches of, or the approaches of critical geopolitics helps us understand those cultures of empire, imperial cultures or colonial cultures. But also those kind of political economic perspectives help us understand shifting patterns of what an empire is and how our empires are and how they operate. And I think those kind of are essential to try and understand the basic building blocks. I think if we work in a domain of just understanding states that are kind of ontologically the same, some are just quantitatively bigger and smaller, rather than qualitatively different, we fail to kind of understand the basic coordinates of what's going on in the world. And I think of course, classical geopolitics tries to theorize, in a sense, a version of imperialism, but it's a very old version of imperialism. It's one that's based on a kind of 19th century European imperialisms, and we can readily understand Russia's invasion of Ukraine in those terms. It's much harder to understand the operations of the United States or the United States-led imperialism of the West in those terms because it operates differently. But that does not mean that it's not imperialism or it is not an empire.
Yeah, thank you, Rory. I think you've really set up the other two questions I have for our panelists. And this question around empire and decolonization. Johan, I want to go to your paper you published with Roman Privalov in the Journal of International Relations and Development a few years ago, 2021. It's a brilliant paper. And it looks at this kind of lack of grand forward-looking vision in contemporary Russian space policy, which you might say is almost a little bit out of touch with the imperial ambitions that Russia has demonstrated on the battlefield and elsewhere. But there's a few interesting points that the paper makes, which is that Russian space policy is not really focused on hegemony, but rather on reaching equal status, catching up, being competitive, and so on. And that there's this kind of paradoxical way in which Russia simultaneously seeks sought lasting space cooperation with the US and criticizes the US for militarization of space. So this is a paper obviously published before the latest set of events. If you can just give us maybe your biggest takeaways from the Ukraine war so far and how the claims that you guys made in the paper have held up.
Oh, good question. We should probably update it now and do something more about this. And well, as you just to reiterate, our point was that Russia still sees itself as a great power, or wants to reclaim a great power status, obviously. And so they have they're nurturing in the leadership. Then I'm talking about the Kremlin, Putin's gang, and how they nurture that, but they feel that they're backsliding, that it's declining, they're failing on many fronts. But you can still see yourself as a great power, or returning to great power status. So this explains why they're okay. Maybe we can't reach hegemony like the Soviet Union maybe tried, or the leaders of that country did, but we can at least reach some kind of equal status with the main other, which still in Russia is the United States. They still identify with, okay, damn it, they're going ahead in the space program. Now China is popping up, but still US is still the main adversary, and the one we compare with all the time. This is what we've seen when we studied the Russian space programs and talks by the Russian leadership and the former Roscosmos director Rogozin, for example. But then about the war, that was something I need to think a little bit about, the war now. Yes, maybe you need to. Can you elaborate a little bit what your idea is there for?
Well, I suppose how the last 2.5 and a bit years have changed your own thinking, for instance, on relationship between state and corporate sector.
Yeah.
But also in particular how Russian space policy has adapted.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well. Okay. Good. A couple observations. One is now there's a new Russian space strategy which is extremely focused on the military and launching new military satellites, as I understand it. Which again other states are also doing, including Sweden, by the way. But then there's also one issue that I've been puzzled about is the continuation of the International Space Station, and especially, I mean, it's a multilateral group, but Russia, the United States, the leading partners, but also Canada, Europe, Japan. But then, I mean, when the war happened, and then immediately there were sanctions against Russia and condemnation of this illegal invasion of Ukraine by the Russian military forces, Rogozin, who was still at the time the director of Roscosmos, said, okay, we will pull out of the ISS. We can't be a part of this. They are not our friends anymore. And many thought that, okay, they will maybe get the cosmonauts back home and then just abandon the Russian part of the ISS and let it crash to the ground, which would mean if the whole space station wouldn't function, because the Russians, I believe, they are in control of the engines for this. So that would mean no more ISS. I mean, it's going to die anyway in a couple of years. But, you know, but now they're still continuing to do this. And I'm not a space nerd in the way that I follow all of the launches and back and forth and the names of the astronauts and cosmonauts. But they still travel together and they still work together up there, the Americans and the Russians. To me, this is extremely puzzling, and maybe I wouldn't jump to answers why they continue doing it. I think it's worth doing some research on this. Why the hell can they continue to collaborate up there? And I'd like to see it from sort of a positive, okay, there's still opportunities for cooperation. But sort of they changed their mind. So yeah, let's continue until it's not technically feasible to continue. So that's one observation. There's many more to say about the actual war and the use of satellites and how they react to Starlink and what Musk did, but leave it for another question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very good. Now, Almo, I want to take you back to the conversation that you guys were about to have, and I said, wait, hold your horses for a moment, because we want to involve the audience in this. And this is essentially on I'm going to call it decolonization project, or you might say agenda. And I think it actually unites a number of different trends. I think there have long been attempts from countries, especially in the global south, to question some of the colonial practices that spacefaring nations, major spacefaring nations, have long used, the way they place their satellites in strategically important regions, the way they have their bases often on stolen land and so on. Then, of course, the UN agenda to limit and constrain the militarization of outer space and so on. I think this is also part of that. And then the kind of political and in some senses religious work that we heard about in MJ's talk, which is also a kind of articulating a decolonial agenda. So how successful has this project, if you may disagree with me that it is a project, you can say, no, these are quite different things, and that's fine, but let's assume for a second it is. How successful has it really been?
That's a really good question. I think it's currently perceived as probably, maybe I'm not going to call it a project, because I don't think it's like just one unified thing that's going on. I think, in the multilateral context, obviously you have a lot of voices, and the strength of those voices also differs from one player to another. The big spacefaring powers, they speak the loudest, and that's normally what we hear in the media. We hear a lot about all of the media examples that Mary Jane provided us with, right? And what we were saying during the break is that we have this perception of, the colonial movement is very much going ahead and nobody's actually opposing it. But what you actually see in multilateral discussions, it is quite different. First of all, I think the first thing to consider is how states view space and space security so differently. For the US, for China, for Russia, the big spacefaring nations, also Japan, India, more emerging states, they see space as, this is this new environment of exploration, geopolitical power, etc. We're gonna send ourselves there, whether this means technology, whether this means humans, whether it's for scientific exploration or for military uses, whatever it might be. But it's more kind of like outward looking. Whereas a lot of the global south, their focus when it comes to space security and space more generally is space for Earth. Rather than space for space, is more of a space for Earth approach. We want space because it can provide a lot of technology that we rely on every day. So for example, for island nations, we rely on space technology, like GNSS technologies, to identify illegal fishing, for example, to monitor the status of coral reefs. And if they didn't have access to that technology, those things would be a lot harder to achieve. So in a way, they view space and space technology as a great equalizer of, it helps bridge a lot of differences that have existed throughout, humankind's history. And so that is their primary interest in space. And so you do hear a lot, not just in space security discussions, but overall, you do hear a lot of voices from the global south saying that when we propose new mechanisms, when we want to have new measures, and when we're having these discussions, it cannot mean that we're going to enact mechanisms that are going to impede the access to that global south. So essentially, what happened on Earth in a way with environmentalism, right? You had like the big powers essentially mess everything up, quote unquote, and then everybody's feeling the effects of that, and then the global south, they have less access to resources, etc., and they don't want that being replicated in space. So you do hear a lot of discussions against just mega constellations and the effect that this has in astronomy, for example. Talk about debris and how this can affect satellites, because obviously the countries that have the least amount of satellites are the most vulnerable. Like a country like the US, if your asset is destroyed, you have a lot of redundancy to fall back on. But a country like, for example, Angola, who has just one satellite, I believe, if that satellite is destroyed, then they can only rely on third parties to access those services. So you do actually hear a lot more in the multilateral discussions than we see in the media. And what I was saying before during my presentation, it is these middle powers, and it is the emerging spacefaring nation, those nations who are maybe not yet spacefaring, who really have the power to shift the discussions. At Unity, we've been doing a lot of work regionally with different regions, in Latin America, in Africa, with small island nations, and in the ASEAN region as well. But and we have reports for all of these events that we've done, so I encourage you to go read those. They are publicly available on our website. But it is specifically the African and the small island nations events that really leaned into this sort of discussion, that why these states have to be part of these discussions, and the power that they actually have. In the OEWG that I talked about before, the main state that the leading voice for cooperation throughout the whole process was not one of the mains that you would expect. It was not Russia, it was not China, it was not Japan, it was not the US, it was the Philippines, who is, very much an emerging nation, and they led a working paper co-authored by and supported by, I think it was 34 states, on responsible behaviors. They led, and these were types of cooperation that you wouldn't expect. We had a working paper that was sponsored by the Philippines, with Germany and Nigeria, which if you are thinking of strategic alliances, you would never think of those three countries. That's just like a random group. And it is precisely that which you want to see in these multilateral discussions. Because in this event that we did with small island nations, it was pointed out that if they just kind of like left to the devices of the big space powers, the risk that you have is that smaller nations are going to have to choose sides between the mains who are leading the discussion. And instead, what you need is that kind of like, perhaps not regional consensus, but, putting our heads together at the regional level to reach some sort of common understanding, so that when you go to the multilateral arena, your voice feels a little bit louder. And so that makes the discussion seem to be a little bit more in like an equal footing, if that makes sense.
Johan, can I involve you in this conversation?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes,
this is
allowed.
fascinating.
Lovely.
And thank you for sharing your observations on the UN discourse and the multilateral discussions going on about space, which, I have to rest my case on what's going on there because I haven't studied that. So you're involved in it. So I like to hear about this, and it makes me think of this. I'm not going to say so much about the decolonial agenda versus a colonialist agenda, but from a political science perspective, I can't help that. So my tools would be the standard approaches of a liberal ideas versus the realist ideas. Liberals think having a more positive outlook on the world. We believe in treaties, in normative power. We can regulate the world, while the realists, it's all about muscles. So if you don't have capabilities, I think this turned off. I'm not sure. It's on. Then the unarmed priest will be beaten by those who have weapons. What I think here is that it's great that there is a sort of a discourse that is challenging the dominant, still dominant, very dystopian colonial ideas, and those I believe are dominant among the leading space powers, also in China, even though they might say different things in there. But look at the leading space players. Who are they? China. Are we going to trust in China? It's a presidential dictatorship. There's no human rights in China. If they establish settlements or colonies in space, what is it going to be like? Something like the Uyghur camps, so we can't trust China to run anything in space. I don't believe so. And the same with Russia. Russia is now turning into a dictatorship as well. And what is happening with India? India's also I mean, it's not very strong democracy anymore. And there's tendencies even in the United States. I mean, my fellow political scientists who study democratic autocratic development say if Donald Trump wins this election, it might be the beginning of the end of American democracy as we know it. So, and Elon Musk now fully came out to he supports this, and he is obviously a major player by being the owner of SpaceX and building all of the ships that's helping NASA to land on the moon and so forth. So, and he dreams of building settlements on the moon and eventually on Mars. What kind of settlements, what kind of societies will we have in space if these guys will run these places? Do you think it's going to be respect of human rights, democracy, pluralism? I don't think so. I mean, we can. This is not what they dream of, and they have a very vague ideas about the kind of societies in space, if there would be some. So that's something I have very dystopic outlook, and therefore I find it great that you have found that there are voices who are counteractive to this. And there are, I mean, there's always sort of the light side and the dark side in space politics, so as it is on the moon. And I believe that also, if we go back to the Outer Space Treaty, it actually, I mean, it was a way to prevent Cold War in space, right, and to prevent colonization. And it builds on what I would call very liberal principles of to prevent this belongs to all of humankind. They said mankind, but I would like to phrase that as humankind, and it's and not to colonize celestial bodies, not to use weapons of mass destruction, and all of that. So I believe that if they could do it then at the height of the Cold War, then bloody well we can do things now too. So I'm also want to be hopeful.
Thank you. We're going to come back to hope and despair at the very end. Rory, before I involve the audience, there's probably time for a really quick response if you wanted one.
Which of my clusters of notes? I mean, I would say that democracy is under threat in the United States, not just by contemporary tendencies, but its foundations, and that's systematic. It's limited pluralism at home and slaughter and exploitation abroad, and from its entire history. So I would class it with Russia and China as a threat to these things. You looked at me earlier and you were like, it's not the powers you'd expect that were like driving cooperation. I would not expect major great powers to drive cooperation. They drive competition. Apart from those small moments, and actually, the International Space Station is somehow. I mean, I have quite romantic visions of that cooperation. It's kind of despite the tendencies of history. But I think what you can see at the minute more broadly in geopolitical shifts in the world is there's kind of the world is changing from the unipolarity of the United States and the Western-led order, for better or worse. There's different models of how we would reconstitute a new order or a modified order that are emerging, and we of course see the Russian version, which is like return to a great power multipolarity. There's moves to form the BRICS, and I think that there's some reference here to the kind of the non-aligned movement from the Cold War era, where there was attempts to build alliances largely based in the global south that would step outside the kind of Cold War binary. And I think we can see something about obviously Russia's involved in BRICS and so on, but there's an attempt to kind of constitute some other form of kind of a way of doing international politics. But I also think there's huge possibilities, and it's great to hear the examples you're talking about particularly alliances of nations, particularly across the global south, but also involving medium powers or middle powers such as Ireland, where I'm from, or Sweden or Denmark, to be involved in trying to produce within the frameworks of those multilateral institutions, where they do have values that are embedded that aren't represented in the kind of the universal values that aren't embedded in things like Russian multipolarity, to try and push against the kind of imperial and colonial logics of the great powers, who are of course active and dominant within those institutions. That's hard work, but it's ongoing, and it's great to hear. That's a place of hope for me.
Right, thanks a lot. We have two questions. I think the gentleman here was first.
Thank you. So my name is Andreas. I work as a defense consultant at Navigate, but I wrote my thesis at the Institute for Space and Air Warfare at the Danish Royal Defense Academy. And I think one of the things that really annoys me is that the EU is not mentioned at all. Like, the EU is really pushing for normative liberal principles for the use of space. It makes a lot of the data that it gathers from space publicly available, so every nation has access to it. But the EU is also being pushed by some of the movements that we're seeing, and it has been, for example, willing to balance towards the US with China and Russia in the 90s and in the 2000s. So, kind of your thoughts on this? Where do you see the EU from now on, and where is it going in space? And then also think of the thing about the colonial and normative perspective. Like, does it really matter? Because it's going to happen anyway. You know, who's going to stop the US? Who's going to stop Musk and so on? Are the Africans going to do it? No. Like, that's just the truth. It's where it's going. So does that perspective matter at all in this discussion?
So we do have a skeptic in the room. Very good. If we can have the second question together with this one. Yep. If you could also introduce yourself.
Yes, absolutely. My name is Søren Riesgaard. I work at the British Embassy, where I'm specifically working with the Scottish commercial space sector. Now, this question is personally out of my personal interest purely. Keep that in mind. But I'm interested in this idea. Can we trust China in space? Well, on the one hand, I feel like this is an ideological question, but it's also a matter of, well, look at their track record. China has not had a single failed mission to the moon or to Mars, if you don't consider exploded launch vehicles. But secondly, I think it's less a question of can we trust China and more a question of can we afford not to trust China. I don't think the answer is non-conversation, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on what is the role of non-American Western space nations in the future, looking 50, 100 years ahead. I'm really interested in your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you. And is there a third question we can pair these two with? No? Yep, Trine?
Thank you so much. So this is very much both on actor participation in multilateral discussions, but also very much on private and public collaboration. So Eisenhower back in the 60s warned us of a military-industrial complex, and now within defense innovation, we're very much seeing both in the US and in countries like Denmark, a defense-industrial academic complex. How do you see that as relevant to outer space discussions? This particularly in Denmark, we call it closely knit arm's length collaborations. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, pros and cons and everything in between, and also very much how is the private industry in the commercialization of outer space included in multilateral discussions? Thank you.
Thank you, Trine. So what I would suggest is that we move this way again, and we start with Almu, and you're free to pick any of these questions. By the end, it would be great, of course, if we had some answer to all of them, but don't feel you need to answer everything.
Okay, I wrote everything down. I hope I don't forget anything, but if I do, I think you'll have my contact details, and or we can talk after the the round table as well. But I'm going to start with do the minority opinions and perspectives matter, because that really kind of like got to me. Absolutely, it does matter. Every single country is beholden to the international order, and I mean, sure, the international order is based in it's an unequal system. Not everybody has the same power, and we see that very clearly with the Security Council. But things are much harder to get done if there are a lot of voices speaking against that one thing. So that's precisely what those voices have to be present. If they perceive that as something that shouldn't be done, nobody else is going to go to the multilateral debate and speak for that, for that one state that doesn't agree with the majority opinion. So it's one voice in like one single African country does not do too much, especially if you put it against a big power like the US or China. But if you have if you have several regions that have those same concerns and they bring those concerns to these multilateral debates, that absolutely has an effect, not just because diplomacy will not get done in the way that those big powers seek, but also because public perception matters, and the big powers are the first ones who are interested in being, positively perceived. So it absolutely matters. When it comes to the EU, I do think the EU is perceived as, an entity or an actor that does seek to be transparent, and for example that we've worked with them when it comes to our space security portal, for example, but the EU is not a state. And so when it comes to multilateral discussions, that does affect things. The main characters, so to say, of diplomatic discussions are states. And this affects non-state actors as well. This affects the commercial industry, which was somebody asked about it as well. I think it was you, yeah. But you do hear, I mean, the EU does have a strategy of operating in multilateral fora like the UN, where they try to agree on things and they bring it to the UN as a group. I think it's Article 34 of the EU Treaty. And so you have stronger voices within the EU in the context of space. For example, you have France, who is, as a permanent member of the Security Council, is also present in everything. They've been part of every single GDE. They've been very active in the OEWD as well. And they've been advocating consistently for transparency. And their own rhetoric as a state as well is very much about one has to be transparent. So you do see that individually from states within the EU, but that's why perhaps the perception is that, the EU is not really talked about, but the states of the EU individually are also bringing the EU message to these multilateral fora. So I think even if it's maybe not as clear that it comes from the EU itself, it is there. Then there was a question about, can we afford not to trust China when it comes to space? I mean, I'm contractually obligated to be, a defender of cooperation, but it's not just a contractual obligation. It is very much a belief that I have. And I definitely think that cooperation is better than competition. And we've seen the evolution of China, as you were saying, as an actor in space, as a relevant actor in space. So I definitely think, and in the Western kind of like perspectives, in the Western views, when we talk about these space security issues, we perceive Russia and China as a group. Like, they do everything together, they're besties. That's not necessarily the case. They do have very different policies. And there are instances where China is going to seek to cooperate with other countries, even unusual allies, where Russia maybe is not, and vice versa. So one has to be on the lookout for those opportunities. The Chinese, for example, have a booming commercial industry that isn't really often talked about. So it's important to consider that. But yes, I definitely think that cooperation is always better than competition. And then Trine, to your questions, how is the private industry included and active participation of different stakeholders? Traditionally, space security discussions have been restricted to states, and not just states generally, but to specific states. We've had discussions in the Conference on Disarmament, which is a body within the UN in Geneva, which is not every state has a membership to the CD. And then we had these groups of governmental experts, which were limited to a number of like 25 governmental experts. So that's not really a lot. The P5 were always there, and then it was just like a random group, well, not random, but they were chosen on the basis of geographical diversity. But that meant that a lot of people were left outside of the room. And it was precisely because the Global South and those states whose voices we sometimes perceive don't matter, but like they don't have as much influence. It was due to their, stating that they want to be part of these discussions, that we've shifted into a more inclusive debate. We now have more conversations about space security at First Committee, where all members of the General Assembly are welcome. And we have shifted from DIIS to these open-ended working groups, where not just all states are welcome, but also all non-governmental actors. So we have the commercial industry, which is allowed to be present in the room, submit working papers, do statements, and we have civil society as well. We have academia, and in fact, in the only OEWG that we've had so far, the chair of the OEWG, I was part of the secretariat, so I worked with him in organizing these panels. We had panels for there were 4 sessions for the first 3 sessions where we talked about substantive issues. The 4th session was about negotiating the recommendations. We invited experts, and we invited a diverse group of experts from different fields, from different countries, different genders, different ages, to talk about these issues and to bring their unique know-how and perspectives. And that was really helpful. That was one of the things that states and people in the room more generally valued the most, and that we seek to bring to future multilateral discussions.
Thank you for that very detailed answer. We've still got some time for the gentleman to respond also, but we are slowly nearing. These clocks are not saying the same. I'm going with the one that gives us more time. Rory, do you want to jump in and take some of these questions or respond?
Try and take 2 of the 4 minutes. Okay, that's hard for me. Irish, I'm
sure you can have another minute.
Very loquacious.
I'm feeling very generous.
I just want to jump around a little bit. I think that question of the inevitability of this kind of great power-led space colonization. I mean, in one sense, there's kind of material and environmental limits that I think could express themselves to this project at just a very nuts and bolts level. But I think at the more level of kind of governance and back to this kind of question of the UN, I know this is not the forum where we talk about kind of intellectual kind of theorists very much, but there is an historian, Charles Tilley, who's no longer with us, and Charles Tilley had a analysis of how powers or states or empires kind of achieve their goals or achieve hegemony, or they tended towards hegemony in his view. And for him, this was always a mix of coercion and consensus. So no power could sustain itself long just using coercion, but coercion was always necessary, at least at the edge. And I think that we're in this same situation today with these kind of great powers. Yes, they have vast military power and so on, but they also depend, all of them that we've been talking about, these great powers, depend on the consensus of other nations and other fora. And I think the UN is a place where consensus for this model can be tested and is being tested somewhat successfully, at least. And that could happen through other alliances as well. But the UN is certainly desirable forum for that. So these states are not all powerful, and I think that buys into a kind of myth-making of those great power states, that they are somehow all powerful, or just because they've got bigger weapons that means that everyone will go along with it. This question of the kind of defense industrial academic network, this is something I'm very concerned with, and I'm kind of working with myself, and maybe to a little bit indirectly come back to the EU question. There's been very troubling things, to my mind, going on recently with, for example, academic funding through the Horizon programme and its successor. And there's 2 motions. One is that the dual use should be loosened to allow kind of a greater expanse of dual use technology. This is extremely troubling in and of itself, but this is also troubling in the context where states who are currently committing genocide are also a part of Horizon Plus programs. And this is also sucking funds towards militarization in the EU through academia away from other civilian use, including all sorts of things about infrastructure, health, education, and so on. This is very, very troubling, and particularly in the context where I'm from and I work, of Ireland, which is a neutral country, and there's a move, which I'm sure some of you are aware, to try and of the government in power to wither at least neutrality in the Irish case. And there's a massive drive of private industry to kind of open up this kind of cabinet of investment in the arms industry. And part of this is through dual-use technology in the space sector. And we have Irish space entrepreneurs actively involved in lobbying the government to get rid of neutrality so that they can open up markets for dual-use technologies. This is very, very troubling to me. I think you're right to point it out. This is not something that happens out there that we just analyse. We're also embedded that within our academic institutions.
Johan, I think you have the last word.
Okay, thank you. Wow. I think I'll pass on the EU's role question. I think it's been addressed very well here already. But about the European military industrial complex, actually published a paper on the European military civilian industrial complex this year, earlier in January, in Defense Studies, if you're interested, where we spell out some of our thoughts on that, Emilie and my co-author. That observing especially about dual use, how it's expanding, and which is an observation general of this kind of market, where going from military defense, producing weapons, to security, a security market, so much wider. So security can be a lot of non-military stuff about intelligence and observation and fighting organized crime and all of that, obviously. And so it's a blurring of boundaries. And even we had a conference with the Swedish defense or security sector, and they say some of those companies are a little bit unsure if they should, is this our identity to be part of the security business, or sometimes because there's opportunities, market opportunities. So there's a bit of I would say a blurring of boundaries is what's happening here with these corporations. And also, again, we have talked a little bit about government, what governments do, and what private industry does. But as you emphasized earlier, they're joined together in very complex ways. So, and one term that often pops up is public-private partnerships. And I think there's even policies about that in the European Union, to have that in the UK, Sweden, and the United States, obviously, and also in space. I mean, SpaceX and Orbital, many others, they don't operate in a vacuum and then how do they make money? Well, it's together with their biggest client, NASA and US government. Without government and tax money, they wouldn't be able to grow the way they do and do things. They work on behalf of government together with them. So we have to understand these complex relations between politics and business. Anyway, but back to the final thing about should we trust China in space? And well, yes, we should trust that China is a growing great power also in space. We should trust that China shows capabilities, and that we also should trust that China's space program has a very strong military element, and that's growing, and that the Chinese military is largely in control of the Chinese space program, according to experts that I talked to. We should also trust that the Chinese space program is tremendously important in Chinese patriotism. It brings the nation together. They are super proud of their space program because it is very successful in their missions. And we should also trust that they do have a very ambition to become a colonizing power in space, whether they talk about it explicitly or not. However, having that said, I'm all for dialogue. As every good diplomat knows, you need to communicate with everyone in the world, whether they are your friends or antagonists. Of course, we need to. Otherwise, we can't we can't believe in anything. We need to be able to talk with those that we don't trust. Thank you.
That is actually a very positive note on which to end. I'd hoped to ask each of you for a positive or negative trend, but I fear we've run out of time. Although I get the feeling from the conversation that not all questions are answered, and maybe there's a time on the way out to continue the conversation briefly. Please follow me in joining our wonderful panel for what I thought was a really fruitful and interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.